what kind of new leader do we need for these days?
So true.
Welcome. My name is Brian Finnerty. I'm delighted to be here today with you to talk about Ruth Pakaluk. And very recently, the Vatican just made an announcement that official proceedings could open possibly to see if Ruth Pakaluk, Massachusetts woman, should be declared someday to be a saint of the Catholic Church. And the local diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts, was given permission to proceed with those investigations. And Ruth was a pretty amazing individual, amazing life story. She was a Harvard atheist who became a Catholic, became a pro-life activist, a mother of 7, also a member of Opus Dei. I'm here with John Coverdale, a historian of Opus Dei, who's written biographies of various individuals in Opus Dei, including has a profile of Ruth Pakaluk in one of his books. And John, thank you for being with us.
Well, my pleasure.
And so, John, tell us a little bit about Ruth Pakaluk. I mean, what made her? I think she had a quite attractive personality, dynamic personality. And can you tell me a little bit about her?
Well, I think you've kind of summed it up already. Yes, she was very active, very intelligent, funny, committed, generous sort of person. The word that always comes to my mind, I think about Ruth, is that she sparkled.
She sparkled. And another point of her biography, which is sort of interesting, is that she actually died at a quite young age with those small children. She died at age 41. But even until the end, had quite still without all that, had that sparkling personality.
That's true. Yes, she was diagnosed with cancer at age 30, and lived another 8 years, and really lived a very active life right up to the end. Although I'm sure much of the time she was in great pain.
Yeah. So at age 33, being diagnosed with cancer, and then passing away at age 41. And so tell me about the beginning of her journey towards the Catholic Church, and what sort of started pulling her in that direction.
Well, as you already said, when she entered Harvard as an undergraduate, she classified herself as a pro-choice atheist. In her sophomore year, she took a course, an American history course, and in that they read Governor Bradford's account of that terrible first winter that the Pilgrims went through, and how those who could get out of bed dragged themselves around to help those who couldn't. And she was very moved by that. And she said to herself, I want to live like them. I don't even care if what they thought was true. I just want to live like them. Now, after a while, she began to discover that it was important whether it was true or not. And she and her future husband, who had been raised a Catholic but had separated himself from the church by the time he reached college, they set out on a journey to find out if Christianity was true, and then ultimately if Catholicism was the brand of Christianity that they ought to embrace. And they read a great deal, both of modern authors and of ancient authors, the fathers of the church. And they also began religious practice, first in a congregational church, but they found that very uninspiring because they seemed to be interested almost exclusively in social action and that sort of thing. Good things, of course, but they didn't seem to have any real interest in theology or even piety. And so eventually they decided that the Catholic Church was where they needed to be.
You know, her husband, by the way, is in a very unusual position right now. I mean, so her husband is still very much alive and is giving newspaper interviews about, hey, this is what my wife was like, and meanwhile, you know, it may turn out to be that he had been married to a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's sort of a unique position for somebody to be in. Huh?
I would think so.
Yeah,
I would think it
that's true.
would be.
And so she can you tell me more then a little bit about her journey towards the Catholic Church, and also ultimately then in 1984 she joined Opus Dei, and explain a little bit what Opus Dei is and how she came to join Opus Dei.
Okay, well, Opus Dei is an association of the Catholic Church. Technically, it's something called a prelature, but I don't think we want to spend our time delving into that. I like to say that Opus Dei is a message and a group of people who try to put it into practice in their own lives and spread it to others. And that message is that God calls everyone to holiness, and for most people, in ordinary life, raising their family, working at whatever job they have, leading a social life, all the ordinary circumstances of life can and should lead us to God. And that's kind of what Opus Dei is really all about.
Okay, good. And how did Ruth Pakaluk ultimately decide to become a member of Opus Dei?
Well, she and her husband, right after graduation, spent 2 years in Scotland because he had a Marshall Fellowship to study there. And then when that was over, they returned to Harvard, where he was going to enter a doctoral program. And one weekday, he went to Mass in St. Paul's Church, which is the church of the Harvard Catholic community. And another student, I think a physics student actually, approached him and said, I think you might be interested in these activities that are run by Opus Dei. So he went and was very taken with what he saw and went home and told his wife about it. And then they both began attending Opus Dei activities. And eventually she joined Opus Dei a few months before he did.
Yeah, and even before Opus Dei, they're sort of like unusual kindred spirits in that didn't they decide to get married fairly soon after they both as undergraduates at Harvard after they met? And can you tell a little bit about that story?
Well, I don't know that there's too much to tell about the story. They did get married right after they graduated, and they were engaged before that. Mm-hmm. And even at that time, which was maybe 50 years ago now, but even at that time, it was quite unusual for people as young as they were to be engaged, much less married. And they quickly had their first child and then eventually 7 children.
Yeah. There's also actually the story of how she chose to go to Harvard is actually sort of interesting. So that was not her first inclination to go to Harvard. Is that right?
Well, that's true. She thought she wanted to become an airline stewardess because she said, all you've got to do is smile and you can see the world. But then a neighbor, a Harvard grad, encouraged her to apply to Harvard, and she was accepted. And then she said, well, I have to go because otherwise I'll never know if I can compete against the best. Mm-hmm. She very quickly discovered that she could compete against the best to such an extent that in her sophomore year, she was a teaching assistant for a course she had taken in her freshman year.
Yeah. And then you mentioned about her ultimately having 7 kids, and she had at one point she had started out life earlier on at Harvard, being a pro-choice atheist, and then with kids coming along, that also changed her convictions about abortion as well. Is that right?
Well, I think it's partly right. So I think her uh, decision that abortion was morally evil and was the killing of an innocent person uh, probably predates her first child. What happened with the child, her husband says, is that her pro-choice commitments went from being intellectual convictions to being a visceral, personal commitment.
And so then, yeah, so then she wound up becoming active in pro-life
Well, that's right.
activities.
She and another graduate student started a pro-life association, which they called Harvard and Radcliffe Pro-Life Advocates or something like that. She became first a board member and then eventually president of Massachusetts Citizens for Life.
And she was quite a compelling speaker, huh?
She was a compelling speaker and she was a formidable debater. So if someone wrote to her and said, you know, we'd like you to speak at our school or at our parish or whatever about pro-life things, she would typically say, well, I don't want to give a speech, invite somebody from the other side and I'll debate them, because if I give a speech, 25 people may come who are already convinced, but if we have a debate, we'll get 200, and some of them may be open to changing their position. And she was such a powerful debater that eventually they couldn't find anybody to come and debate her because people said, "Oh, I don't want to take on that woman."
Yeah, so eventually she had 7 kids, and early life in academia and graduate school, that they're not necessarily rolling in cash. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's correct. They were actually not only in graduate school, but her husband got a job teaching at Clark University in Worcester, Mass., which was, from the academic point of view, a very good appointment, but paid very poorly. They could only buy a house in one of the poorest sections of the city, and at that it was a very run-down house. The carpets were 40 years old, and the refrigerator didn't work. I think the furnace didn't work either. And yes, they really were very hard-pressed for money. One day, they were visiting some friends who were kind of into marketing, and one of them asked her, well, what brand of toothpaste do you buy? And she said, well, whichever is cheapest. The other woman said, well, don't you have a preference between, say, Crest and Colgate? She said, Crest or Colgate? I never buy either of them. Even on sale, they're too expensive.
And despite not having all that cash, her home was a very attractive place for kids in the neighborhood.
Well, it was very attractive, I think, both to kids and to adults. She, I think, quite regularly baked cookies for her children and their friends as they came home from school. She often took them to a park or summer to go swimming. But also she had a lot of activities for friends, adult friends in the house, despite the fact that it was a small house and a very poor house, and I'm sure never well furnished, but that didn't bother her, and people enjoyed being with her.
With all her pro-life activities and things very busy in the home, things were not necessarily always smooth sailing. Is that correct?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think she and Michael were deeply in love and cared for each other and were happy, etc. But every now and then they had their quarrels. I particularly like to tell about an occasion on which they were having dinner with kids, and Michael wanted to make some plans for the next week, and he said, well, maybe we can do this. And she at the time was involved in a local political campaign, I think maybe for the school board. And she said, well, I can't go because of the campaign. And then he proposed one or two other things, and each time her response was that she couldn't go because of the campaign. So he grew quite angry, and he stood up and went stomping out of the living room. And finally, just at the door, he turned around and said, F the campaign. And he went a few steps further and turned and looked back, and she was smiling at him and giving him the finger. And she said, F. A few minutes later, he came back and apologized, and everything was fine. But yes, that they weren't I don't know, they weren't China dolls. They were real people.
The impression I get is that all that was still almost done with a certain sense of humor as well. Almost.
Well, it may have been.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's true. It could well have been.
Yeah.
But in any case, he apologized and off they went.
Yeah. Another incident that had a major impact on them as a couple was their death of one of their children.
Yes, one of their children, Thomas, I believe was his name, little boy, died of sudden infant death syndrome. And of course, that was a very sad event for them. But she, on the one hand, was very much consoled by thinking that he would be in heaven. But at the same time, she, felt the loss both for herself and for him. Some other woman said to her, well, Thomas hasn't lost anything. He's in heaven. And she said, well, he is in heaven, but he lost the joys of growing up as a boy and enjoying God's world. So she had both under her control.
So, John, another really significant moment of her life came when at age of 33, she was diagnosed with cancer. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that's correct. And obviously it was a shocking event, particularly since the doctor a year earlier, when she went with a lump in her breast, had told her that it was just a cyst. So, yes, she obviously had a good deal of stress at that time, but she very quickly got over it and continued her ordinary life. She had periods of chemo, which of course knocked her out for a while. But if she wasn't getting chemo, she was living as she had lived before, taking care of the children and going about giving lectures, still singing in a professional choir, etc.
Yeah, for me, it's sometimes exploring some of the stories of like how she would announce to her friends, okay, this is the latest news, but let's talk about other things. Let's not make all the conversation about me or.
Well, that's right. And at least on one occasion, after saying that sort of thing, she said it was a group that had gathered to say the rosary, as they did on some regular basis. And she said, okay, let's say the rosary so that Michael, her husband, find a new young wife. Okay, because she realized, in fact, she said that for her, the hardest thing about knowing that she was going to die was to be leaving her children without a mother.
And in fact, one of the extraordinary things about her life is she didn't completely leave that to chance or to prayer alone. Is that right?
Oh, that's correct. And quite close to the end of her life, she said to him, you should marry a particular girl who, it was a very, how shall I put it, unlikely sort of thing. The girl was quite a bit younger than Michael. In fact, not that much older than their oldest child. And she was going to be beginning graduate studies at Harvard in math. And Michael said that he didn't have any particular interest in her. But when she came to begin at Harvard, out of courtesy, he invited her for lunch and found that he did have an interest and not too much later, he married her.
And today she's a well, I think they went on to what to have, was it 8 kids or something like
Something
that?
like that, yes.
And she's also quite an accomplished academic, sociologist,
Yes, she is.
philosopher
She's a
herself.
professor at Catholic University, as is he.
Yep. And so tell us, tell us a little bit more about those days as she was approaching the end. I mean, in 1993, it was getting more serious and it spread to her bones.
Yes, and so eventually she was bedridden. And rather than my telling her, I'd like to read a little bit of what she wrote to a friend, because I think it captures it much better than I could. She says, I've been alternating between deep, painful unhappiness and a kind of serene joy. I try to remember that I should be glad of the opportunity to unite my suffering with Christ. Then, when I actually feel miserable, this all goes out the window. It's tedious. Another odd thing is that for many years it seemed to me as if I experienced very few emotions, all within a pretty reasonable range of intensity. There was the happiness caused by the children. There was exasperation when Michael was difficult, and contentment when things with him were on an even keel. And that was about it. Now it seems to me my emotions ultimately dominate my perception of reality. This must be menopause. It's interesting, occasionally pleasant, often horrible.
And that another extraordinary thing there was also her concern for her friends until the end. And I think you might mention her final letter.
Well, that's right. She wrote a long letter to a high school friend who was a non-believer. Again, I'd like to read a little bit. I know that reading is not the usual thing on an interview, but again, I think it's very hard to encapsulate. She says to this friend, my cancer grinds inexorably on. It has spread to my lungs and liver. I'm going to be on one form of chemotherapy or another for the rest of my life, which in all likelihood will not be much longer. I don't complain, though. I've had a great life. I've known wonderful people. I have done interesting things. I've had many gifts and talents that made life lots of fun. Singing, acting, public speaking, etc. My husband is great. My kids are great. And I really believe the Catholic faith. This life is short and is merely the qualifying exam for the real thing. I regret that I have not written regularly to you. Your friendship has been a great source of happiness.
And so she passed away at age 41. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it was also so extraordinary how in the days before cell phones, the news spread really quickly.
Yes, their pastor, who was there in her final moments, talks about that. He said, I don't know how it happened, but people just knew. And the house began to fill. And he says, certainly would have been easier for them to have been alone, but it was a great privilege to be there at her deathbed.
And so people who want to find out more about her, there's an official website that people can search for, searching for Ruth Pakaluk. People will find that, Ruth VK Pakaluk. And so I understand that the next step will be now the diocese may open an investigation.
That's correct.
Of her of her whether she lived a heroic life,
Mm-hmm.
and then that will be packaged up. In fact, you were the historian for another cause, which was also referred to the Vatican.
Was the historian for the cause of Father Joseph Muthkith, who was the first priest of Opus Dei to come to this country back in 1949. And he came with several other people. It was a remarkable journey, if you like. I think you could even describe it as a journey of faith, in the sense that there were three of them. None of them spoke much English. they had almost no money. They didn't know anybody in this country. They didn't know anything much about the culture. For instance, in a letter to the founder of Opus Dei, St. Josemaria, Father Joseph remarks with considerable astonishment about the fact that their next door neighbor, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, took out his own garbage. He just couldn't quite imagine that. And yet, despite all those limitations, drawbacks, Father Joseph was completely convinced that Opus Dei would go forward in this country because he was convinced that it was literally a work of God, that God wanted it, and therefore it would succeed.
Well, an extraordinary individual, Father Joseph Muskies, an extraordinary individual, Ruth Pakaluk. And so, John, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for being with us.
Hi, I'm Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Recently, I had a viewer write me, "You don't just observe communities from a distance. You enter their worlds with respect. It's almost tender, and give your work a soul that statistics alone could never capture." Here at A Journey Through NYC Religions, we go through every alleyway, every streetway, all 5,400 miles, in order to capture the stories about religion in New York City. Some of those people we invite to come back to the studio to do a program with us. Stay tuned to see what we show next.